Both of you. We have about 25 minutes, half an hour for questions and conversation. But I think before we open it up, I wanted to, at the risk of kind of putting you both on the spot, because I didn't warn you that I should have warned you that I would do this, so you could decline. But I wondered if you wanted to take a brief moment to comment on anything that you heard in each other's presentations. Professor Dorrien, maybe if there were any of the texts that Venerable Bodhi shared that resonate as similar or different to Christian scriptures, and Venerable Bodhi, like in the history that Professor Dorrien traced, do you see any parallels maybe to the development of socially engaged Buddhism and its relationship to other forms of Buddhist thought and practice?
Well, we could. Let's just resume the conversation we were having when we walked up here.
Yeah, sure. I would love for you briefly to share that with everyone else.
Yes, you studied at Claremont, actually had a course with John Cobb. John Cobb is the founder of the Buddhist Christian Dialogue in the American Academy of Religion, and much of the sort of fruit of that dialogue. I mean, this is much of the language that we have about engaged Buddhism and Buddhism being tied to sort of social justice movements comes out of some of this exchange that has gone on in the Christian Buddhist dialogue that starts in the mid 1970s. And Cobb himself says that the goal of Christian Buddhist dialogue is what he calls mutual transformation. That people, you don't just look for what's similar to what you already believe in the other. I mean, that of course is going to happen. And sometimes that's the best way to start. It's just, okay, can we, have some sort of commonality here? But also, what is in the tradition of the other that just seems to be just totally lacking, or at least that I just never heard of in my own tradition. And so that back and forth, that conversation that produces mutual transformation, I think that's right. That is the goal. So there's whole sort of the question to you, and I'm sort of put it to you. What do you think are sort of examples of that happening that you think where indeed that something like that has occurred?
Well, I think that in many ways Buddhism or Buddhists have been lagging behind Christianity in developing something like a counterpart to a social gospel. Even though in Asia something called engaged Buddhism arose, even before the encounter with Christianity. I would say it's starting late 1940s, 1950s. There was a Dr. N. Bedkar. He was from the untouchable community, and through his natural intelligence, he was able to go on to get a doctorate degree, I think, in Britain, and studied in the United States. He went back to India and was one of the authors of the Indian Constitution, and he was looking for a religion to replace Hinduism because he felt that the Dalit community was oppressed by Hinduism, and so he studied various religions, and he wanted to choose a religion that was indigenous to India, and so he embraced in the 1950s Buddhism and started to develop his own interpretation. But he died about within the first year after he embraced Buddhism. But it continues, the Dalit movement continues, or the Neo-Buddhist movement continues in India. And then in Vietnam there was Thich Nhat Hanh. But what I would say about what's happened with Buddhism, too much in my opinion, that there's been, especially in Western Buddhism, too much of an inward focus on meditation, mindfulness, and a rather naive belief that simply by encouraging people to develop mindfulness, one could bring about social transformation. I think we really need, in Buddhist circles, what I would call an impassioned commitment to social, economic, racial, and environmental justice. And that's where I think where we can receive a lot of inspiration and also understanding through studying the development of the social gospel in Christianity and in Judaism as well.
I have like 12 other questions that I would love to ask both of you, but I think I should, in the relatively limited time that we have. So again, I want to invite people to, if they have questions for our panelists, but also at the same time, if there are perspectives from your own faith tradition, to the extent that people are grounded in one, your own reflections on these kinds of economic justice issues as your tradition may see them.
Well,
oh, and you turn the switch.
Good timing on the question. I was going to say I give a Jewish amen to both of you, and not coincidentally, I think you both complemented each other perfectly. And the Jewish piece, which fits also, is I guess you could say from the Hebrew Bible and economics that's about inclusion of everyone, and particularly care for the most vulnerable and marginalized. It's not strictly socialism, but it's certainly not ruthless capitalism either. What I did want to ask you both, and you both touched on this, it's about changing values and changing structures. For those of us who see our social justice work or economic justice work as faith-based, how does the theological project of attacking, I'm going to use that word, the idolatry of the market fit in? Is that just something we slip in under the surface, or we get to that at some point, or we do that right up front as we're doing the policy work? And this is at a moment when, just, I think, not irrelevant to the discussion, is a majority of young people apparently look on the idea of socialism favorably in America. So how does that all fit together?
I have to try to answer according to my own understanding of the question. I would say probably in Buddhism we wouldn't use the word theological because we don't have a theos or a god, but I would say a kind of philosophical or spiritual aspect comes from the idea that every human being is a center, I say a center of subjective experience, and as such is of intrinsic value, inalienable intrinsic value. And we would say every human being has, speaking again from Buddhist terms, has the potential for enlightenment and liberation. And so it's the responsibility of society to provide a foundation for each individual to fulfill their own aspirations, their own ideals, as long as they don't harm others, and again within the Buddhist framework, to have the supportive material and social conditions to pursue their spiritual development up to the point of enlightenment. And so when there are oppressive social, economic, political conditions, that serves as an impediment that prevents people from unfolding and realizing their potentials.
I've been involved in social justice activism, solidarity activism for 40 years. I noticed a long time ago, and it was partly a draw to me, that the people who hung in there, who didn't seem to make success the criterion of whether they were going to stay in the struggle, were people who had some spiritual wellspring in their lives that centered them in a way that just enabled them to hang in there. And to know that they're in it to be faithful, not necessarily to be successful. That success thing comes and goes, and isn't the question of judgment. And so therefore it also is sustaining. With regard to what you and I were talking about, Michael, just before I sort of came up here, that we're now living in this just colossal sort of crisis of a civilization right now, and in a world in which it's so intense every day, the threat. I mean, today it's Jerusalem, and tomorrow it's going to be a tax bill, and we're living on the edge of this just extraordinary intensity that just isn't sustainable if you're just in it, I think, on sort of political terms, just sort of battling all the time. I think that spiritual wellspring is sustaining actually for social justice work.
Yeah, I really appreciate that. It's partly, I think that's an answer to the tension that we were sort of stuck on at the very end of the conversation with Rachel Schneider. There was a bit of a tension between, the long-range vision of maybe upsetting capitalism and creating a fundamentally more just society versus the more short-range goals that we really have to keep in sight. And what I hear you suggesting, Gary, is that, having that long-range vision also gives you the energy to pursue the more concrete policy changes that you might have to do, tomorrow and next week. So it's not as much of a contradiction maybe as we had early in our conversation.
It's true. Although that long-term, short-term thing, we just have to deal with that and negotiate it all the time anyway. For example, I got books out there on economic democracy that are, it's the big scale speaking to the question, there is no alternative? No, there are alternatives, right? Some of them we can see in incipient form, some you see through, 14,000 producer cooperatives that are actually out there in this country. We don't have networks of them yet. We're sort of building on that. We don't really have a true movement for economic democracy that holds these things together, but nonetheless, we've got a cooperative sector out there. A few years ago, we were having discussions about public banks. We do get public banks that actually invested in cooperatives. That'd be a tremendous breakthrough for economic democracy. So I think holding that, saying that yes, there's a vision of what we could be doing and where we could be going, that's important. At the same time, there's always just what's right in front of you. And what's right in front of us isn't just that. It's just trying to save the shreds of what decency we've got left in this country, which is being attacked every day. Because if you give certain people the way, they're just going to destroy everything that's public except the Pentagon.
Can I also ask you both of you maybe to comment very briefly on this one powerful phrase that Michael used, this idea of the idolatry of the market. That really jumped out at me, and it's really a Hebrew Bible concept in a lot of ways, to sort of label these dangerous economic practices as idolatrous. Does that click or resonate with you guys, and in what ways? Or not so much, or you could pass.
I think the idea of idolatry as something terribly evil again comes out of the Judeo-Christian tradition, but I call it rather. In Pali, we have a term vipalasa, which means an inversion or distortion of proper value. So I say that a healthy society would have a hierarchy of different levels of value. So at the fundamental level, we have what I call natural value, the value of the natural world, the physical and biological support of all life forms. Then we have above that social value, the value that comes from our interpersonal relationships, from the value that can be imparted to us by the social structures that we create through our interactions. Then above that, a level above that, we would have aesthetic value, devotion to the arts, pursuit of beauty, literature, music, the visual arts and so forth. Then at the apex would be spiritual value, the pursuit of one's highest spiritual ideals. But what's happened in especially in the United States, but in the world, is that monetary value, which maybe has its place within its proper place, subordinate place within the sphere of social value, has somehow broken away and become parasitic upon the whole structure. And so now it dominates, so the natural world just becomes a source of natural resources to be extracted and exploited. Social relationships, again, become transformed into that of oppressor and oppression, exploitation, the suppression and so forth. As the arts become just commercialized forms, and even religion gets, in a sense, subverted by the quest for monetary value.
The critique of idolatry is indeed a very big deal in Judaism and Christianity. I think one way of thinking about it, though, that can be more, broader, is that it's the critique of any time that you are absolutizing that which is merely human, something that's created. The question of idolatry is simply the question of whether what you have invested ultimacy in is actually worthy of the investment that you've made. And the literature that goes with this theme about the market as the idol of our time runs with this. Kathy Tanner just did her Gifford lectures on this topic. Harvey Cox, at a more sort of popular religion and society level, has a book out from Harvard University Press called The Market as God. and simply sort of trots out the ways that can make rather unsettling reading when you just see how, yes, indeed, how we've just sort of granted to the market the capacity of judgment, and it sorts out winners and losers and the way we think about ourselves, and ends up manipulating our desires so that we end up desiring what it tells us we should want, and so on. And so that, in fact, it does end up sort of working like and giving perfectly, well, could say terrible answers to fundamental religious questions.
Thank you.
I just had a question for Dr. Bodhi. Charities are a source of good, fills gaps that government fails to address. But just thinking about the example of Bill Gates and your item 4, the ways of seeking wealth, seems to meet all those criteria. He's accumulated his wealth without causing harm. He is himself happy. He uses his wealth for good causes, and the last one was he's not infatuated with it well. And somehow he fits all those criteria, but I don't feel that good about it. So I just wanted to see what you thought about someone who has accumulated wealth, the ways of wealth, and the ways that are prescribed, but he's kind of extra governmental, has an undue influence on any number of social issues, good and bad. So how does that fit into the overall structure of economic democracy?
Well, I think.
Yeah, I know the passage that he was referring to.
I mean, if I hear your question right, I think part of it is, this text that you shared.
Yeah.
One way to read it would be to suggest that if an extremely wealthy person, abides by this fundamental, Buddhist ethics and by the Dharma,
yeah,
that their wealth is, is okay. And I think what I hear kind of between the lines of your question is that maybe the kind of extreme accumulation of wealth of someone like Bill Gates is just not okay, no matter how the wealthy person, treats their wealth. Right, that kind of extreme inequality, there's no justification for it, regardless of the individual ethics of the wealthy individual. Right, is that?
Yeah.
Well, I think we have to remember that these texts come down from 500 BC. So I don't think in India at that time we would have had the extreme types, the extreme types, the extreme levels of inequality that we have today, and the extreme amounts of wealth that any one person could accumulate. But I would say, okay, that somebody possesses a lot of wealth, accumulates a lot of wealth, and then they use it for beneficial purposes. Within the given social structure that we have, I would say that is commendable. Though I don't think that the way Bill Gates has been using that, from what I've read about using that wealth, partnering with Monsanto to try to spread genetically modified seeds throughout Africa as the solution to the problem of hunger in Africa, that is commendable. But just, if we put that aside and say that an extremely wealthy person is using their millions and millions of dollars in order to promote the health, the well-being of others, that is commendable. But I would perhaps say that in the present economic structure, that there perhaps should be a ceiling on the amount of wealth that any individual could accumulate. This was a point that John, is that your name? Brought up in the earlier session.
Sorry.
Yeah, but this is just a suggestion that there should be a minimal basic income so that everybody is assured of a secure standard of living and a maximum level of wealth accumulation.
Professor Dorrien, I want to put the same question to you, because I'm going to totally get this scripture wrong, but there's the famous Christian, it's in the Christian scripture somewhere, I'm sure you know, about the harder for a wealthy man to get into heaven than a camel through a head of a pin, or something.
Needle.
Thank you. I love that the Buddhist monk has corrected me on my Christian scriptures. Thank you. But so in your reading of the Christian tradition, is there something fundamentally wrong with extreme wealth in itself? or is there a way for, you know, ethical action on the part of a wealthy individual or institution to make that wealth more okay for society?
Oh, I think the scriptural witness just reverberates with the sensibility that there's such a thing as having enough. And to have too much, to have more than you need when others are suffering is just repugnant. And I think that's pretty strong in Scripture. You know, that text, though, that you just cited, you know, remember how it goes on. Then they say, well, then how is anyone saved? So here are these, actually, you know, poor, struggling, not wealthy people at all, ready, not just to hear that as, oh, that's applying to somebody way up there who makes 10 times as much as I have and joins field to field, as Scripture says. But no, they're actually worried about, wow, if this is that stringent, then, you know, what are the prospects for so many? They're worried about, you know, what might happen to people. And Jesus' response is, anything's possible for God, right? It ends up becoming a text about grace. That we're all saved by God's grace, not through our moral effort or achievements or the like. So these two things do sort of go together. Certainly in the witness of the New Testament, that there's a social ethical dimension that speaks a quite stringent but sometimes harsh word about these topics in ways that are hard, sometimes uncomfortable, just even to read in church on Sunday. And yet it's always in the, you know, within the loving embrace of a theology of love and universality, that God wills the salvation of all, and God's will shall be done.
Thank you. We have very limited time, so a quick question. And
yeah, well, I want to just thank you so much that this work exists. I feel so grateful for it. I feel like it's going to strengthen my work also in a project. My wife and I co-produce a TV show on education, arts, and social change. And one of the things we've been talking about on our show is an organization called the Network of Spiritual Progressives, founded by Michael Lerner and Cornel West. And they have a program to address these issues. One idea is called ESRA, the Environmental Social Responsibility Act, which would make corporations be ethical by law. And the other idea is a global Marshall Plan. So, and they have like congressional resolutions behind them. Keith Ellison is back one of them, you know. And so how can we expand that work, okay? And how can we create a media that has a spiritual progressive perspective? I'd like to remind people that Pat Robertson still has a TV show. And yet, the left has not countered that, yet. We try to talk about these things on our show, but we have our Nielsen ratings are like below 1,000, you know. But how can we get this out into the world? Thank you so much for your work. I think it's essential. You definitely, you know, need to be heard from more on big shows like MSNBC.
Thank you.
Why don't they know about this work?
How do we shift the larger public conversation to mirror what I agree has been a great conversation that we're having in a relatively smaller group today?
I don't know anything.
Not that either of you are experts on media.
I know the Network of Spiritual Progressives, they have their magazine to which I subscribe, Tikkun. But it probably has a relatively small circulation compared to, what are some of the other competitors on the right?
Yeah.
Well, it's true. And I'm in the network. I've spoken at its conferences. I write a lot for Tikkun. I certainly know about the work you're describing. It's crucially important work. There's nothing quite like what Michael has pulled off there and has kept going. The reference to, you know, what it's like over on the other side, there's just no comparison whatsoever. I mean, it has been a work of love to which Michael himself has poured himself all these years, and he's had his home bombed a couple of times, and you know, sort of suffered, you know, pushback from one community to another, and got Duke University to take over the magazine, so that at least you got that sort of venue to try to make sure that it has a future. But we're not remotely like what goes on over on the other side, where they get all this right-wing money. That also, incidentally, when the right wing gives people money, gives money to institutions, they just give it away. They don't make them obsess over how have you spent every nickel and sort of justify it the way we do over on our side.
Yeah. How does the Interfaith Center get funders like that? Gary, I'm very conscious that you had an
Yeah.
appointment and it's 3:42, so...
Maybe we could get one quick question?
But,
Two-
yeah,
two more.
but if you need to run, you should run, but if there's,
I see.
if you have time for a couple more questions, go ahead.
Hi.
Yeah.
Dr. Gary, thank you so much for raising the topic of neo-abolitionism, the neo-abolitionist movement. Many times when we hear the word abolitionism or the abolitionist movement, we tend to think of it as a question around slavery and America's very ugly, ugly past, in the way that most of us don't want to go back and touch that for any reason. But we fail to realize sometimes that the abolitionist movement was not just about the inhumanity of chattel slavery. It was about the economics of this nation and the economic system on which our nation is built that is intrinsically unjust. The ways in which the system is built precisely to create an underclass and to forward the wealth of just a few. And many of us tend not to look at the new abolitionist movement, but it's a very strong movement, and it is helping people to realize that the economic system that we are built on is not in any way going to become just the way it is. It is built to be unjust. And if people across the nation can realize that this is not about, you know, the blacks who were enslaved and the whites who were not, it's about people who were poor, and how to make that disparity that much less. I believe that the responsibility of faith, as we know it, is to take a real good look at this system and to do what we're doing here today, to join hands and hearts and minds across faith traditions, so that we can take a responsible look at our economic system. Because each of the faiths that we've examined here today, including other faiths, right, Islam, all have scriptures about how to behave justly in our economics. And yet we see things like the prosperity gospel movement just kind of ballooning and going crazy, and everybody trying to keep up with the Joneses and get their 2 cents in, get their piece of the pie, to the detriment of other people. So how do we get this information out? How do we, and I'm speaking to you, how do we use this work that is going on here today? I'm very excited, as you can clearly see, about this, because I think it needs to be taught in churches and synagogues and mosques and temples, and people need to hear this so that they can attach their belief system, their faith in their God, to their money that they're spending.
Thank you.
Thank
you for that really eloquent point. Yes. Actually, much of the new abolitionist movement simply went by other names, so you don't really know, it doesn't sort of self-advertise for what it was. For example, the socialists and progressives and church leaders who founded the NAACP in 1910 wanted to call it the new abolition movement, because that was fully that's how they thought about what they were doing. And the only reason they didn't call it that was they said, if we call it that, we're never going to get a Southern chapter. And we've got got a mania of lynching going on at that time, and we've got 14th and 15th Amendments have been lost, and they said the work is just too crucial. We've got to try to spread this thing all over the country to build what's, after all, a quite radical organization. So we can't self-sabotage by calling it that. So they ended up calling it the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, because W.B. Du Bois did insist that it's got to be, colored people had to be in there in order to name that this is about all the people on the non-white side of the color line who struggle with different forms of oppression throughout the world. This isn't just a U.S. thing, and it isn't just about the 14th and 15th Amendments, but it is about those things. Now, there were arguments about that within the NAACP, because there were white liberals on the board who was like, it's a more expansive and radical idea of what the NAACP was than they had really signed on for. But that is the idea that Du Bois defended all through the years that he ran Crisis, and that is part of the legacy of the NAACP. It is new abolition.
And Venerable Bodhi, from your perspective, I was really struck before that you also This just came up in passing, but in your remarks before, you also linked your own focus on economic justice issues with a focus on racial justice in the U.S. and globally as well. How do you see those connecting in your work at Buddhist Global Relief or whatever else?
Well, the work of Buddhist Global Relief is primarily focused internationally. Especially what we do is to provide assistance to poor communities around the world who are oppressed or afflicted by chronic hunger and malnutrition, by finding organizations working in those countries and partnering with them to start projects which will help them emerge from poverty and the oppression of hunger and malnutrition. And one part of our types of projects that we support is because looking into the underlying roots of poverty and chronic hunger, we found like one major contributing factor in many traditional cultures is the subordinate status of girls and women. And so we support and design projects that will provide poor girls, with the opportunity to continue in school and to have meals at school that will encourage also their families to allow them to remain in school.
So this is a great reminder that although our focus today is mostly specifically on economic justice, but race and gender and nationalism and other criteria can't be left off the table.
Yeah, but to the point that this woman just raised about new abolitionism, I would say that there are maybe two movements which are functioning in this way, especially to promote economic justice. One is William Barber II, his new organization called the Repairers of the Breach, and it's relaunching a kind of poor people's campaign to pick up where Martin Luther King broke off. And the other is coming from the Catholic side. This is Sister Simone Campbell. It's called Network. And she was the one who sort of mobilized a mass campaign to oppose the tax bill that was going through the Senate last week. But it didn't succeed, unfortunately. Her campaign.
Time for one more question.
I need to say, I have a very unexpected medical appointment I just have to get to. So thank you, friends.
Thank you so much. If you had a question more specifically for Venerable Bodhi, maybe we have a couple more minutes, or we could.
It's really for both, and I just, in the interest of time, I'm impressed, and thank you, Professor Dorrien. Best wishes on your medical appointment. Thank you, Venerable Bodhi. My question is for both, but I appreciate you being able to stay and answer.
If you put the microphone,
I am aware of how many interconnected facets there are to the economic injustices of the world. Thank you. I'm impressed with all of the interconnections between all of the oppressions and interactive injustices economically. Some of them haven't changed for centuries, and the interconnection between women and girls. I started as a Presbyterian. You asked this question. My Bible verse was Amos 5, my Bible chapter. Truth and justice are at a distance from the public square, and let justice roll down like water, so I won't repeat the whole thing. Point is that I've been doing this activism for years. My focus right now is on interpersonal violence and dealing with domestic violence and human trafficking, which are both fueled by economic injustices. Women leave when they have economic empowerment. That's the #1 criteria for anyone's ability to leave an abusive situation. We know the underneath belly side that's a scourge of human trafficking in this world that is fueled by pornography and other industries that are exploiting. We're talking about children. The average trafficked person is 12 or 13. I'm also concerned about the rising level of violence in general, and so all of this is interconnected with what you've both been speaking. How do you draw the line between people rising up and fighting? Or can we fight in a way that continues to honor the nonviolent movement that I so passionately believe in? Thank you.
Is that a question?
Yes, that's a question.
The question is, how does one maintain nonviolence in the face?
Yes.
And I appreciated on the flip side of that, your comment earlier that maybe everyone doing mindfulness meditation is not going to solve the world's problems either. So it can't just be an
No, it can't just be an internal,
but it also
process,
shouldn't be a violent struggle, ideally. So
I say definitely one has to make a strong internal commitment to follow nonviolence, recognizing that if one resorts to violence, it's going to provoke a reaction which eventually is going to be self-defeating. So I say the way to both preserve one's own moral integrity as well as to accomplish one's aim in the long run is through nonviolent strategies.